Hello, everyone. Welcome to our next session, which will focus on the efforts of the Foundation for Social Connection Scientific Advisory Council, or our SAC, and our mission to translate scientific evidence into real-world solutions for social isolation and loneliness. Some of the world's foremost minds in researching and understanding social isolation and loneliness will discuss the systems approach of cross-sector investigation and action across the lifespan, or much more easily, the social framework, and the sector reports that we have released thus far. For those of you who I have not had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Abigail Barth, and I'm the Research and Innovation Program Manager at the Foundation for Social Connection. And in this role, I have the opportunity to work with our Scientific Advisory Council to advance research and the translation of research to action to advance social connection. And this, of course, includes our sector reports from the social framework, which you'll hear more about today. Our first speaker is Dr. Julianne Holt-Lunstad. Dr. Holt-Lunstad is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Brigham Young University, where she was recently named the Martin B. Hickman Outstanding Scholar and is also the director of the Social Neuroscience Lab. She also has an adjunct professorship at Iverson Health Innovation Research Institute, Swinburne, University of Technology in Melbourne, Australia, and is the founding scientific chair for the Coalition to End Social Isolation and Loneliness and the Foundation for Social Connection. Dr. Holt-Lunstad's research is focused on the long-term health effects of social connection, and her work has been seminal in the recognition of social isolation and loneliness as risk factors for early mortality. Her program of research takes an interdisciplinary and multi-level approach to understanding the associations between social relationships and long-term health outcomes, factors that may moderate these associations, and the biological pathways by which these associations occur. She has recently begun work that examines how social relationships may be utilized in interventions to potentially reduce risk. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Holt-Lunstad to the Action Forum.
The introduction. I am very grateful for the opportunity to introduce to you all the social framework, including what it stands for and why it was developed. One of the biggest challenges that we face is that despite strong evidence of adverse effects of social disconnection, there's no gold standard approach to mitigating these risks. And since there's currently no pill to solve this problem, and although pharmaceutical approaches are being explored, there's no single approach that is likely to be right for everyone, given the variability in underlying causes. So it's not surprising that the evidence on effective interventions is mixed, with some that are effective and some that are not. But according to the National Institute of Health, developing effective treatments takes a really long time. And this is because 95% of the time they fail. And yet we see so many social interventions being launched and scaled without adequate evidence of their effectiveness. So of course we want solutions and we want them now, but how do we responsibly accelerate this process in a strategic way? The social framework aims to facilitate and accelerate progress towards a society that values social connection across the lifespan and in all societal domains. This framework illustrates untapped opportunities to significantly influence population health, and many of which are not adequately addressed in national public health discourse and strategies today. So drawing upon, merging and expanding upon the socio-ecological model and the health and all policies model, a Scientific Advisory Council of interdisciplinary experts created the social framework. So what is this? We developed this framework with the person and individuals at the broader at the center. And just to remind you, the social is an acronym that stands for Systemic Framework of Cross-Sector Integration and Action Across the Lifespan. And so starting with the individual that we're seeking to serve at the very center of all that is done, It also includes, which is depicted in this larger green area, illustrates the individual, interpersonal, institutional, community, and societal levels of the socioecological model. So it acknowledges that the person is embedded within each of these levels, each of which may potentially contribute. But we also, depicted in blue here, illustrates the sectors included within the Health and All Policies model, which was developed by the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control. And so this recognizes that each sector of society can potentially play a critical and important role. There are arrows that connect these to represent opportunities for collaboration across sectors, and acknowledges and encourages approaches that are transdisciplinary. But we also wanted to ensure that we acknowledge several important cross-cutting themes. So depicted in the gold arrows illustrates these cross-cutting areas of focus, including the importance of across the lifespan, diversity and equity, and as well as evidence and application, and that this it also includes the many different types of modalities that may be approached as we consider this across the levels of the socioecological model and across the sectors represented in this in society. So again, here this is represented in a slightly different way that helps us really systematically break this down into a way that's more actionable. And so each of the columns represented in green represents those same levels of the socioecological model that were in the previous figure. And each of these blue rows represents the sector of society. And so then each cell represents the intersection between these two. And importantly, each cell represents an opportunity for solutions. And so by numbering each one of them, this helps us to systematically identify areas of opportunity and, of course, gaps in our efforts. Now, unfortunately, most of our efforts are within mostly just one of these cells. Those that are focused on the individual and within the health sector. What this suggests is that there is 95% is untapped opportunities to affect change. And so it's hoped that this framework can allow governments, institutions, and others to systematically identify, test, and evaluate potential solutions that can accelerate progress in this area. So the foundation has begun to write reports that break this down by sector to make this a little bit more manageable, and to really dive into this in more detail. And so the first focuses on the health sector, which includes clinical, population, and public health. And we made this available for public comment, and we are currently revising it, and it should be made available soon. But I'll highlight some of the recommendations within each of the levels of influence across the socioecological model. Now, the health sector report is intended for several different audiences, including practitioners, such as clinicians, social workers, those who operate community programs, technology, and other interventions, as well as researchers and policymakers. The report identifies compelling evidence-based interventions that address social isolation and loneliness, as well as advancing social connection that we have and can be implemented by healthcare actors. And importantly, this is not an exhaustive list. It's meant to be illustrative to spur new ideas and application. And another major feature of the report is to identify gaps in the research to spur development of new and more targeted interventions. And so finally, the report identifies policies and system change that can have an effect on each level of influence. And so I'll now briefly highlight some of the major cells within the healthcare sector that are included in this report. And so that first cell, numbered 1.1, is really is identifying potential approaches that focus specifically on the individual. These are things that different stakeholders can do that consider factors unique to the individual that can aid in approaches to educate individuals and provide them with the tools to address social isolation and loneliness and support an individual's ability to achieve improved social connection. The next is focused on interpersonal efforts. And this approach is focused, in essence, acknowledges that individuals are situated within relationships and networks. And so this section points to approaches that different stakeholders can take to foster social connectedness or address isolation and loneliness, focusing specifically on relationships and social networks. The next area focuses specifically on how to create connected communities. And while there are many community-based programs, most of these are still focused on the individual, although delivered within communities. But we also need to expand this to focus on approaches that are targeted and towards creating connected communities. And then finally, we focus on approaches that are needed to directly address the larger social factors and structures that can either facilitate or inhibit social connection. And so we need to acknowledge that there's only so much individuals can do, and often systematic barriers can exist. And so these type of approaches include things like policies, practices, and larger societal norms that can directly influence the level of connectedness, both at lower levels, including the individual level. So included in this report, there's also a section that focuses on cross-cutting considerations within the framework. And so this section of the report includes considerations that cut across all levels of the social framework. So this includes consideration for each age group. And this, of course, is useful for those who are aiming to develop, measure, or implement solutions for different age groups. And acknowledging that different approaches might be more appropriate for some age groups than others and are sensitive to some of those needs. It also addresses the importance of considering the modality of delivery through which any intervention is delivered and how that modality may make a difference. And then finally, considerations to ensure that solutions and policies recognize health disparities and aim to be accessible and inclusive. We are really excited to be able to release the final version soon and to continue this work. So please stay tuned for our updated report on the Social Connection website, on our page dedicated to our social framework. And next, Mark Van Ryzen will be sharing more about the report we developed, focusing on the education sector. So I'll turn it back to you now, Abigail.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Holt-Lunstad for sharing that informative presentation. We continue to be inspired by the contributions she has made in evaluating and addressing social isolation and loneliness. And I'm excited to now officially welcome to the stage our next speaker, Dr. Mark Van Ryzen, who serves as a research associate professor in the College of Education at the University of Oregon, in addition to a member of our Scientific Advisory Council. His core research interest is the development and integration of streamlined, efficient prevention strategies into large-scale delivery systems, particularly schools and primary care settings. He focuses on how peer and family processes impact adolescent behavior and adjustment, and how these processes can be modified by technology-supported, integrated approaches to prevention. He has both basic and applied aspects to his work, in which research findings on adolescent development can inform the refinement and optimization of prevention programs, and in turn, the implementation and evaluation of prevention programs can inform developmental theory. Mark, welcome.
Thank you, Abigail. I appreciate that introduction. As Abigail noted, a lot of my research is in social relationships in K-12 settings. So I was particularly grateful to be included in this, the authoring of this report. I think it's a very important statement about the ways in which we can address social isolation and loneliness in the education sector. For those that have read the previous report that Julianne was describing, you'll find that the structure of our report is very similar. We follow the social framework that she's laid out. And there's even some similarities in terms of the kinds of things that we're touching on. For example, within the individual area, we touch on how an approach like mindfulness can be beneficial. And that's something of a universal truth within the education sector or within any sector. However, there are some key differences, some real strong takeaways from our report that differ from the previous report, and I'd like to highlight a couple of those. The first is the cost of social isolation and loneliness for this population. This is an especially vulnerable population. The K-12 sector contains individuals who are very young, who don't necessarily have the background or the social skills to overcome some of their social isolation and loneliness issues. And the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, hit the education sector particularly hard. And there is a lot of unfortunate consequences that are emerging from the time when schools were closed, and students did not have the opportunity to not only connect with friends, but to be in a social setting and to be building those social skills. So the population here is especially vulnerable, and in particular, the adolescent developmental period is a critical time when peer acceptance plays an extremely important role in all aspects of an individual's life. And so if peer acceptance is lacking, if that's something that an individual is not able to achieve, they're going to have, there's going to be pervasive consequences in other areas of their lives. In particular, their ability to attend and finish high school. So the cost of social isolation and loneliness in this population is particularly high. Now, there's a couple of things that we do highlight in terms of ways in which the education sector can address this issue. In particular, the interpersonal aspect to this is very important. There's a lot of things that schools can do to build positive interpersonal relationships among students. And we highlight a number of those in the report. We have scientific evidence for the efficacy of advisory programs, for example, a teacher and a group of youth being together for extended periods over the school year or perhaps even multiple school years. Peer-to-peer mentoring, bringing youth together, older youth with younger youth. Instructional approaches like the good behavior game, which is particularly effective with early elementary students. And then something called cooperative or peer learning, a particular form of small group instruction, which has proven to be highly effective at not only building positive interpersonal relationships, but also promoting academic achievement, reducing mental health problems, reducing behavioral problems, and a number of other positive outcomes as well. So the chapter highlights these and promotes them as ways in which schools and districts can go about addressing some of the costs of social isolation and loneliness. Now, at the community level, one of my key takeaways from this chapter is the importance of scientific evidence. And Julianne highlighted this in her presentation, but we pay particular attention to that. Given some of the limited resources that schools and districts often have, there's a strong need to be incredibly efficient in choosing to invest resources in a particular direction. And in this particular case, some of the things that we highlighted are certainly avenues that we believe schools and districts should consider, given their foundation in scientific evidence. There are situations where sometimes schools and districts have not always allocated their resources toward evidence-based programs. And so we really wanted to point out the importance of considering the evidence base to make sure that only evidence-based programs are selected. And finally, I wanted to highlight one particular area that, again, Julianne brought up, this idea of diversity and inclusion. This is particularly important in the education sector, given that education is a stepping stone in so many ways for underrepresented, underprivileged youth to better their situation. And if schools are not actively promoting diversity and inclusion, then it's possible that this pathway is not available to youth who may be underrepresented. And so what we wanted to do is to point out that there is an evidence base for ways to address this. There are, in fact, very few programs that have been, or approaches that have been found to effectively address the issues of diversity and inclusion. But I wanted to highlight one that we bring up in the report. This is, again, cooperative or peer learning, which has evidence for being able to reduce disparities in not only social aspects, but also academic aspects. And we found that we can reduce disparities based upon race, ethnicity, and we can also reduce disparities based upon special education status. And so here again, we have a scientifically based approach that schools and districts can use to promote equity. And so we wanted to make sure we highlighted that in the report, because again, we need to consider evidence. We need to consider scientific evidence when we're making decisions, and diversity and inclusion is a particularly important aspect of K-12 education. So with that, I'd like to turn it back to Abigail. I believe we're going to be transitioning at this point into a small breakout room and continue the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark, for sharing that important perspective with our audience. And we're so grateful both to Julianne and Mark for their continued contributions to this work. And I'll also shout out that we have another report that's in development addressing social connection in the labor sector. And it's really exciting. We hope you follow along and visit our website. I believe Mariana posted in the chat where you can always find continued updates on reports that we've written, upcoming reports, and I've also included in the chat that we actually have a public comment period open currently for the education report and would love your feedback. That's how we make sure that these reports are useful, that they are inclusive of different perspectives and different stakeholders in this space. So we really, really welcome all feedback and thoughts on the report. Thank you so much, Mark, again, and we'll see you all soon.